So, I know for many of you who believe in a society that isn't, defined by things like inequality, bigotry, injustice, general just all-round cruelty, have basically been a bit depressed for quite a long time. I can empathise. I've been on a bit of a downer myself. You've been pretty down, I would imagine, since 2019 in particular. Essentially, that's when we entered the apocalypse. Not only have the Tories under Rishi Sunak resorted, of course, to austerity, but they've deliberately and incessantly waged so-called culture wars under both Liz Truss and Boris Johnson as well, of course, is Rishi Sunak, for a long time. Basically, what that means is tapping into the basest prejudices people have about vulnerable minorities like refugees, migrants, trans people, for cynical political ends, often to distract, of course, from people's sense of economic grievance, which of course is more than justified, not least in the current crisis. I mean, it's basically felt like being trapped in a pub with like some obnoxiously bigoted guy who's pissed and just ranting at you, kind of spittle speckling your face. I'm not sure that's a word, but you get the gist. But you can't escape because they're the government. They run your lives. They're in charge of your existence. Yeah, it is depressing. Easy to think it's all bleak. We're trapped on what some, of course, call rainy fascist island for the rest of our lives. This also, of course, feeds into Labour's right-wing shift because there's this sense that basically the British public are irredeemably socially conservative, that they have to basically pander to everyone's least favourite racist uncle in order to get elected, which, again, generally involves tossing various minorities under a bus. And at the same time, of course, that you can't support transformative economic policies which would actually deal with the huge insecurities that have become to define the existence of millions of people because people won't wear it. They just think it's too radical, etc. Well, okay, this research is right up your streets, guys, because I'm going to try and cheer you up now. So, a professor of political science and public policy at University of Southampton, Will Jennings, has written a very interesting and insightful piece. It's fair to say I come from a slightly different place politically than the good professor. I think he's more approving of New Labour's electoral strategy than myself. But what the hell? Let 1,000 flowers bloom and all that. What he does is look at the research which challenges the idea that the British public have moved decisively rightwards, as he puts it, on both economic and cultural issues. Which is the mantra used to justify the horrors unleashed by this government, but also I would say the right-wing shift of the Labour Party. I'm not sure he'd agree with me on that, but, he's provided the research. We can all draw different conclusions. Based on data for the British Election Survey, so this uses big samples of up to 30,000 respondents, and it asks various economic questions, for example, such as, so basically getting people to, look at certain statements and whether they agree with it or not. Like, ordinary working people do not get their fair share of the nation's wealth. There is one law for the rich and one for the poor. There is no need for strong trade unions to protect working conditions and wages. And private enterprise is the best way to solve Britain's economic problems. So the whole point of that is, of course, people then answer, do they agree or not with those statements? And that enables researchers to plot, broadly speaking, where they are on a kind of left-right axis on those crucial economic questions. And then overall, you can look at the results as a whole and see which direction the British public are moving in on those issues, on economic issues. Because what those do is obviously provide an insight into people's general economic worldview. You just ask a few clear statements on economic issues, and then you can plot the overall worldview on the back of it. So what's happened, and if you're listening to the podcast, I'm going to show a graph which shows how voters have shifted on economic issues. What it shows is that they've moved leftwards in the last 30 years, but particularly in the last decade. So the public think the government should redistribute from the rich to the poor, on the whole, not all the public, but the whole point is the kind of where people lean overall. They don't trust big business. They think ordinary people don't get their fair share. They think there's one law for the rich and the poor, and companies will try to get the better of workers if they get the chance. So what it shows is people have shifted over the last 30 years, particularly since 2010, on those economic issues, and they've moved to the left. one of the things I hate is when people go, "Oh, talking about left and right, well, they're irrelevant, outdated labels." It is true, most people don't think in terms of left or right. Most people like to think of themselves as kind of sensible, don't they? And they think, therefore, they put themselves in the centre. That's why you ask these statements rather than go, are you left-wing on the economy or right-wing on the economy? Because that's quite abstract for most people. They think in terms of issues, and these questions are on issues which are more tangible than a kind of left-right axis. But clearly, you can see where people are on the left-right axis based in practice on how people respond to these statements. That goes for cultural questions as well. So the sorts of questions that people asked are, young people don't have enough respect for traditional British values. Censorship of films and magazines is necessary to uphold moral standards. People in Britain should be more tolerant of those who lead unconventional lives. And people should be allowed to organise public protests against the government. Again, now there's been strong, actually, a very significantly strong tendency on becoming more progressive on these issues since 1992. Even Tory voters are less reactionary. I do think it's quite striking that what has happened, though, is a generational divide has opened up, certainly politically. I haven't seen whether there's a generational breakdown, these particular figures. I'm not sure there is. Well, maybe there is. We'll find out. I'll find out and update you. But we know that there's an unprecedented generational divide in terms of how people vote, which isn't the case in the past. So in 1983, young people, there was a lead amongst under 25s for Thatcher and the Tories. They got a 9-point lead over Labour in 1983. But in the last general election, despite Labour's, of course, terrible rout, they did not. Young people overwhelmingly voted Labour and older people overwhelmingly voted Tories. Now, I think cultural issues definitely come into that. So I think, what is different now is, and hope gives you hope for the future, is whereas in the past people have been more to the left on, say, cultural and economic issues than drifted to the right, maybe this generational divide means a lot of, which didn't exist before, means a lot of those younger people will continue to have progressive views, and therefore this will entrench that. We'll see. You might look at this and think, well, why the hell is there such an intense backlash then? If people have become more progressive, what the hell is going on? I think the way to explain that actually is when you get strong progress, particularly with attitude shifting, because of movements which change people's attitudes. So if you look at, movements historically like feminism, the LGBTQ movement, anti-racism movements, what they've done is change people's attitudes, but by doing so, they provoke fear amongst the section of the population who are opposed to that progress, and they become more angry, more vocal, and more emboldened, and often more reactionary. So that's why it's so weird and anachronistic, you might think. How the hell did Donald Trump become president in 2016 when, you would think that attitudes had shifted overall in US society on issues like race in a more progressive direction, and you get the most overtly racist president. I mean, other presidents used what are called dog whistle attacks, where they would say things like Reagan would attack welfare queens, and a lot of racist white voters would hear that and think, you mean lazy black people, don't you? But, Donald Trump just said overtly racist things. You kind of think, how the hell did that happen? Where you get a more progressive environment, and yet you get the most reactionary president yet. And that's because you get a minority, because Trump didn't win a majority, of course, who become more angry and terrified by the fact they think they're going to lose. And I think that, you've seen that, you saw that with, previous backlashes against gay rights. I do think on trans rights, there's a lot of that is people on the anti-trans side think they're going to lose. If you look at country after country at the moment, Spain being the latest, Germany's going to do it soon, Finland as well was another one that's updated to introduce self-identification for gender recognition reform. Country after country is adopting that. Britain will just become the outlier, and the anti-trans people deep down probably know, well, is Britain really just going to stay the outlier, or are these countries really going to repeal those laws? They didn't on gay rights, so it's not going to happen on this probably. So you get that kind of panic and anger, which makes them more, that feeds into how vocal and entrenched they become, which is why you get this kind of backlash even as things become more progressive. But that is my theory, that we should look at these results and think there was hope, that actually it's not inevitable. Things can go backwards. You should never think about history as a linear, always, things improving, people's attitudes getting better. Things can go backwards very quickly and alarmingly, but you can see that people have shifted. What's frustrating is this is happening when Labour are less ambitious and less committed to transformative policies than they were, even though there is now greater public appetite for those things. But I think that provides a strong base for those of us who do believe in a different sort of politics that does call for much more redistribution of wealth and power, for example, challenging the vested interest at the top of society, because I think there was a big appetite for it in a country which is as riddled by crisis as our own. That's my hopeful message. I hope that's cheered you up. I feel cheerful. Please like, subscribe, do support us on patreon.com/ownjose84. I'll see you in a bit.